Hello, everyone. Welcome to my YouTube channel, Prof. Jeffrey Sachs Fan World. And here is today's content, Institutional Fatigue in American Governance. A functioning majority depends on an animating idea, a coherent account of ends and means that can discipline factions when crises erupt. What we see instead is a coalition whose moral vocabulary has thinned to procedure, continuing resolutions, Toblin's clean bills, and parliamentary maneuvers. When process replaces purpose, leadership ceases to persuade and must resort to managing time. Schumer's predicament is therefore structural, not personal. He presides over a majority that agrees on very little beyond the assertion that the other side must not win. Shutdown politics exposes this hollowness. In theory, a party facing a closure of government should converge on first principles: what must be funded, what can be delayed, and what constitutes the minimum social duty of the state. In practice, Democrats fracture along three axes. First, the programmatic axis. Progressives insist that any reopening must protect social spending and labor protections. Moderates prioritize fiscal optics and credibility with markets. Second, the security axis. Some accept Republican add-ons on immigration or defense as the price of reopening. Others see such concessions as the normalization of hostage tactics. Third, the strategy axis. One camp believes only compromise can avert long-term damage. Another argues that conceding now guarantees a repeat crisis in months. A leader can arbitrate among interests. He cannot conjure a shared telos where none exists. Republicans understand this vacuum and exploit it by offering a reopen plan framed as pragmatism without ideology: pay the troops, fund the agencies, side table the disputes. The move is rhetorically elegant because it casts Democrats as the party of conditional governance, willing to reopen only on terms that the public, exhausted by brinkmanship, cannot parse in a news cycle. In a politics of attention scarcity, the side that promises normalcy wins the optics even when it loses policy. The deeper problem is legitimacy. A government that repeatedly shuts itself down, trains citizens to treat public institutions as dispensable. Each closure erodes the habits of trust. Federal workers seek private exits. Contractors demand risk premia. Households discount future promises. Over time, the state's word loses value. In that context, intra-party fracture is not simply untidy, it is corrosive. It signals that the system cannot coordinate even minimal collective action without extracting symbolic victories from the vulnerable. Schumer's toolbox, whips, calendars, message bills, was designed for a politics where parties were coalitions of interest bound by a common horizon. Today's parties are coalitions of grievances bound by a common enemy. That shift empowers veto players and social media constituencies at the expense of institutional bargaining. The leader's authority migrates from the chamber to the camera, where narrative matters more than numbers. But shutdowns are not defeated by narrative. They are ended by votes. A republic survives on temporality, the steady expectation that tomorrow's government will resemble today's shutdown brinkmanship replaces that continuity with volatility. The Democratic split around Schumer is thus a constitutional warning light. When a majority cannot articulate what government is for, it cannot defend why government must be continuous. In that vacuum, procedural cleverness becomes a substitute for moral clarity, and the state, already fragile, becomes governable only by crisis. Every government shutdown in the United States is more than an inconvenience. It is a rupture in the moral fabric of economic governance. When lawmakers allow the machinery of the state to halt, they are not merely delaying paychecks or freezing projects. They are signaling to markets, households, and the world that the American state has become a partisan instrument, not a reliable steward. Jeffrey Sachs would call this the economy of dysfunction. a system that continues to generate wealth even as it dismantles the trust upon which that wealth depends. In economic terms, the damage of a shutdown begins as an arithmetic problem and ends as an existential one. At first, the numbers seem containable: billions of dollars lost per week in halted federal spending, furloughed workers, reducing consumption, delays in infrastructure and public contracts. But the arithmetic compounds into psychology. The U.S. economy, the most powerful and complex on earth, rests not only on capital flows, but on confidence, the belief that the government will honor its commitments, pay its debts, and function tomorrow as it did today. Each shutdown erodes that belief, introducing uncertainty into systems designed to depend on continuity. It is a slow form of institutional corrosion, unseen but cumulative. During shutdowns, the private sector feels the tremor first. Federal employees mispay contractors, halt work, and small businesses that rely on government clients tighten their belts. Consumer confidence dips, investment hesitates, and capital markets begin to price in political chaos. Even if the shutdown is temporary, its memory lingers a scar on the collective faith in fiscal order. The United States has long been seen as the ultimate guarantor of financial stability, the anchor of the global economy. Each cycle of self-inflicted paralysis diminishes that moral credit. Investors abroad begin to wonder whether America's political elite can still manage the basic function of governance to keep its lights on. Yet the damage is not merely economic, it is ethical. A shutdown is a conscious act of harm inflicted in the name of negotiation. It treats civil servants, public services, and ordinary citizens as leverage in a game of institutional brinkmanship. The economy becomes hostage to political theater. When Schumer's Democrats and Trump's Republicans maneuver around reopening terms, they are no longer debating economic priorities. They are testing the threshold of public endurance. How much disruption can the electorate tolerate before it demands compromise? The economy in this calculus becomes the instrument of emotional measurement. This is the moral paradox of modern American politics. The same lawmakers who claim to defend fiscal responsibility routinely inflict economic loss to display ideological purity. It is a form of performative austerity, a politics that confuses restraint with destruction, principle with paralysis. The rhetoric of responsibility conceals a deeper irresponsibility, the refusal to govern. Sachs would call it moral privatization, the belief that collective pain is acceptable so long as it serves individual political gain. Over time, the costs compound beyond numbers. Shutdowns erode public morale and institutional culture. Scientists lose research continuity. Young professionals leave public service. Federal agencies become brittle. The government that emerges from each shutdown is not the same as before. It is weaker, more cynical, more hollowed out. And that hollowing has economic consequences of its own. It undermines the state's capacity to respond to crises, invest in innovation, or plan for long-term challenges such as climate change or inequality. In short, shutdowns degrade not just the state's finances, but its future. Internationally, the spectacle of America's self-inflicted paralysis weakens its credibility as a global leader. Allies who once relied on Washington's predictability now hedge against its dysfunction. Rivals point to the chaos as evidence of democratic decay. In global markets where confidence is currency, America's shutdown politics reads like a credit downgrade of its moral authority. Ultimately, Sachs would argue that these shutdowns are not fiscal events at all. They are philosophical confessions. They reveal a democracy that no longer knows how to reconcile moral duty with political difference or collective stability with individual ambition. A government that cannot stay open, cannot claim to govern. It can only manage its decline one crisis at a time. And in doing so, it teaches its citizens and the world a dangerous lesson that even the richest democracy on earth can go bankrupt in the one currency it cannot print: trust. The fracture between the Democrats and Republicans and within the Democratic Party itself is no longer a story of ideological competition. It is a reflection of a political economy sustained by division itself. In a functioning democracy, parties exist to reconcile interests and articulate a vision of the common good. In the United States today, parties exist to maintain conflict because conflict has become profitable. What we are witnessing is not polarization as pathology, but polarization as product, a manufactured condition that keeps the political marketplace alive. Jeffrey Sachs would describe this as the commodification of dysfunction. Every shutdown, every fiscal standoff, every social controversy is immediately monetized through campaign donations, cable news ratings, social media engagement, and think tank funding. The American political system, in its late capitalist form, no longer rewards resolution, it rewards spectacle. Consensus produces no clicks, no donations, no headlines. Deadlock does. Thus, the economy of governance has inverted power, is maintained not by governing well, but by sustaining the illusion of crisis. The Democratic Party's split from Schumer in this context is not an anomaly, it is an inevitability. The party, long defined by broad coalitions, is now a constellation of competing moral languages. The progressives speak of justice and systemic change. The centrists speak of stability and pragmatism. Both are sincere, but their vocabularies are incommensurable. When such factions meet under pressure, they no longer deliberate, they perform. The Senate floor becomes a stage, not a forum. The press release replaces the policy brief. Meanwhile, the Republican Party, increasingly reshaped by Trump's populism, has learned to exploit this fragmentation. By projecting unity through aggression, it contrasts its chaos with the Democrats' self-doubt. The irony, Sachs might note, is that the Republican movement under Trump is not unified by policy either, but by grievance. Yet grievance as a political resource is inexhaustible. It demands no coherence, only opposition. The Republican message, therefore, is existential rather than legislative. Government itself is the enemy, and dysfunction is. This dynamic transforms governance into a zero-sum economy of legitimacy. Each party defines itself by denying the other's capacity to govern. As a result, the shared foundation of politics, the belief that government exists to serve the public, is replaced by mutual delegitimization. Citizens are no longer participants in democracy, they are conscripts in a perpetual ideological war. Economically, this fragmentation manifests in what Sachs would call the privatization of the public good. Policy no longer emerges from long-term planning, but from short-term bargaining between interest groups that fund campaigns and media narratives. The lobbyist, not the legislator, becomes the true policymaker. Even national crises like shutdowns, wars, or pandemics are mediated through the calculus of donor influence. Each party blames the other for gridlock, yet both remain tethered to the same financial incentives that guarantee its perpetuation. The structural consequence is cynicism. Voters, exhausted by the repetition of crisis and blame, withdraw from civic life. Participation declines, trust collapses, and the political center erodes. What remains are two radicalized poles that feed off each other's existence. Sachs would frame this as the feedback loop of democratic decay. Division breeds apathy. Apathy empowers extremism, and extremism deepens division. Over time, democracy transforms into an oligarchy of emotion governed not by reason, but by resentment. In the shutdown crisis, this logic plays out perfectly. Democrats argue over principles, Republicans capitalize on disorder, and both claim moral victory as the government stalls. But the real economy, the moral economy of governance, collapses quietly in the background. The bureaucracy grows brittle, the public grows disenchanted, and the narrative of dysfunction becomes self-fulfilling. America ceases to be the world's model of stability. It becomes its cautionary tale. For Sachs, this is the essence of America's current political economy, a society that produces wealth through division and identity through opposition. Its politics has become a form of entertainment, not in the trivial sense, but in the structural one. Like any entertainment industry, it depends on continuous conflict to sustain attention. Compromise in such a system is not a virtue, but a liability. Donald Trump has always understood what most of Washington refuses to admit, that chaos is not a byproduct of American politics, it is its currency. Each shutdown, each institutional fracture, each loss of coherence in governance feeds his central narrative that America's political system is corrupt, elitist, and incapable of serving the real people. When Democrats fracture under Chuck Schumer and Republicans appear to seize the initiative, Trump sees opportunity, not instability. He thrives in precisely this environment where government gridlock can be reframed as proof of his own indispensability. Trump's political method is a form of strategic parasitism. He feeds on dysfunction and converts it into spectacle. While other politicians seek to restore order, he performs disorder as authenticity. To his base, the spectacle of Washington at war with itself vindicates everything he has ever said, that the establishment cannot govern, that bureaucrats obstruct progress, and that only a figure willing to break the system can save it. In this way, Trump transforms institutional decay into personal legitimacy. Jeffrey Sachs would describe this as the politics of inversion. In earlier eras, legitimacy came from governing competence. Now it comes from defiance. Trump's genius lies not in policy, but in narrative, in transforming every political breakdown into an episode of populist theater. The government shutdown becomes a morality play about the swamp. Schumer's divisions become proof of elite confusion. Trump does not need to solve crises to win from them. He merely needs to own their meaning. Over time, however, this logic corrodes the foundation of economic credibility. It replaces stability with volatility as the norm of leadership. Philosophically, Sachs would call this the authoritarian temptation of democracy. In periods of prolonged dysfunction, the call for order inevitably acquires an anti-democratic tone. Citizens, exhausted by paralysis, become willing to trade deliberation for decisiveness. Trump's skill is to occupy that emotional terrain, to present himself as both the victim of elite obstruction and the instrument of national restoration. He weaponizes frustration, converting systemic decay into personal mythology. What is striking is how seamlessly this strategy aligns with the new political economy of attention. Trump's every statement is designed for media amplification, concise, controversial, quotable. The more outrage he provokes, the more he dominates the cycle, and the more the public perceives him as the central actor in American politics. He understands that governance has become theater, and in theater, visibility is power. While Democrats argue policy, Trump constructs archetype. He becomes symbolically the last man standing between chaos and control, even as his own behavior deepens the chaos. The paradox is self-reinforcing. The more disorder America experiences, the more persuasive Trump's claim becomes that only he can impose order. Sachs would see this as the moral inversion of democracy, when citizens begin to equate strength with truth and noise with leadership. In this sense, Trump's next move is almost predictable. He will not seek compromise, but confrontation. He will frame every negotiation as betrayal and every concession as weakness. His objective is not resolution, but domination, not in law, but in perception. Each failure of Congress enlarges his shadow. Each division among Democrats amplifies his narrative that only a singular will can replace a broken system. For Sachs, this moment reveals the tragic dialectic of American democracy. Dysfunction produces populism, and populism deepens dysfunction. The republic, exhausted by its own contradictions, becomes fertile ground for those who promise to transcend them by dismantling them. Trump's strategic positioning is not new. It is the recurring dream of every system that has lost faith in itself. As Sachs might conclude, when democracy no longer believes in its capacity to deliberate, it begins to desire command. And those who command soon discover that chaos is not their enemy, but their justification. The spectacle of another American shutdown with Democrats divided, Republicans triumphant in dysfunction, and Trump orchestrating chaos reveals something far deeper than political decay. It is the slow unspooling of a republic that has lost its moral coherence. Governance is no longer guided by a vision of the common good, but by the mechanics of survival. The United States, once the exemplar of democratic pragmatism, now oscillates between paralysis and populism, a system still powerful in form but hollow in spirit. Jeffrey Sachs would begin here with the philosophical question: what does it mean when a government no longer believes in government itself? The shutdown is not just an economic event or a legislative standoff. It is a mirror reflecting a civilization that has come to confuse freedom with fragmentation and debate with disarray. America's institutions still operate, but they no longer function as moral instruments. Congress negotiates budgets, not purposes. Presidents win elections, not legitimacy. Citizens vote, but without faith that the act still shapes a collective destiny. The consequence is a form of institutional nihilism, politics emptied of vision, filled instead with perpetual reaction. The state exists not to plan the future, but to manage collapse. Each shutdown is followed by reopening, each reopening by another crisis, a cycle that imitates motion but delivers stasis. This is what Sachs calls the treadmill of power movement without progress, authority without meaning. It is not governance, but maintenance, keeping the lights on long enough for the next confrontation to begin. Economically, the price of this moral exhaustion is subtle but enormous. A government that cannot plan, cannot invest, infrastructure rots innovation, lags inequality, widens the market. Once a partner to policy becomes its replacement, private capital fills the void left by public paralysis, determining which communities thrive and which collapse. The state, stripped of strategic capacity, becomes reactive, managing crises it no longer has the means to prevent. Each fiscal showdown weakens not only trust in institutions, but the state's ability to act as a stabilizing force in a volatile global economy. Internationally, the moral consequences are even clearer. The United States can no longer credibly lecture the world about governance or democratic stability. Its dysfunctions are televised, the shutdowns, the protests, the internal disunity, and they are watched closely by allies and rivals alike. To Europe, it signals unpredictability. To Russia and China, it validates their narrative that liberal democracy is an exhausted model. To the global South, it exposes the hypocrisy of a superpower that cannot manage its own house. The moral authority of America, once rooted in the example of competence, now erodes under the weight of spectacle. For Sachs, this moment recalls the closing chapters of empires, not those of military defeat, but of moral exhaustion. Rome fell not when its armies weakened, but when its citizens ceased to believe in the Republic. The British Empire collapsed not from poverty, but from the weariness of ruling without purpose. The United States, still immensely powerful, faces the same danger, not conquest, but decay. The shutdown is a symptom of a deeper entropy, the transformation of democracy from a moral project into a procedural ritual. What makes this decline so insidious is that it feels ordinary. The news cycle normalizes dysfunction, markets adapt, voters adjust expectations downward, crisis becomes habit. In such a system, reform becomes impossible because no one believes reform is possible. This is the quiet death of governance, not through revolution or coup, but through fatigue and forgetfulness. Yet Sachs would not end in despair. He would insist that moral failure is not irreversible, that renewal is possible, but only if America rediscovers the philosophical meaning of democracy, that governance is not management, but moral imagination. The question before the nation is not how to reopen its government, but how to reopen its conscience. The republic must relearn the purpose of power: to serve, not to perform, to build, not to broadcast. In his reflective tones, Sachs might close with this meditation: a nation does not fall when it loses its wealth or its armies. It falls when it forgets why it governs. America's crisis is not fiscal, but spiritual. It has power without purpose, speech without truth, and liberty without solidarity. The work of renewal begins not in Congress, but in conscience, the rediscovery that democracy at its best is the governance of hope. Thus ends the analysis, not with condemnation, but with a call to transform the machinery of politics back into the practice of purpose before the world's oldest democracy becomes the world's most elaborate performance.